Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes as folks trickle in here, and we'll be with you in just a moment. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Good to see everyone on for another Mass Cultural Council webinar. My name is Michael Ibrahim, Program Manager with the Cultural Investment Portfolio here at Mass Cultural Council. Our focus is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations. And with that in mind, we are excited to present a webinar on conducting a successful capital campaign during times of stress. I think any capital campaign is stressful, but definitely when you're going through pandemics or other stress, even more so. This workshop is part of our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. Until the end of June, we started in February. We've been offering 2 free workshops every week, and this is one of our remaining workshops for the series. Joining us today are Eric Morcheski and Dion Brown from NMBL Strategies. I'll turn it over to them in just a minute, but just a few ground rules before we get going. If you want to say hi in the chat and indicate your organization that you're representing today, just to give a little wave, that would be great so we can see each other that way. This session does have automatic captioning. So if you've attended a webinar with us before, you're probably used to this, but all Mass Cultural Council webinars and meetings have auto-generated captioning. If this is distracting for you, you can have an option to hide subtitles there at the bottom of Zoom, so you can choose to have that. If you need any additional accommodations to ensure your participation at a future webinar, just let us know when you register and we're happy to do it. We will have times for questions and answers throughout this presentation. I know Eric and Dion want this to be interactive in that way. So if you want to ask questions in Q&A or chat, we can handle that and we can answer them as we go along. The good thing about Q&A though is you can be anonymous. So if you want to be anonymous with your question, that's a great way to go about doing that. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Council's YouTube channel tomorrow. So you'll get an email from me when this recording is available, or you could just keep checking our YouTube channel directly. I'm going to put a couple of resources into the chat as we go along today, including the presentation link today. So I know some of you might want to follow at your own pace with the presentation. So as soon as I turn it over to them, I'm going to put that in the chat for you. This session does run for an hour. We've kind of condensed it because we know Zoom fatigue is extremely real. So we took the hour and a half and made it an hour for everybody's sanity. So we'll be done at 3 o'clock, but we'll have plenty of times for questions and answers as we go along. With that in mind, I'd love to turn it over to Eric and Dion.
Thank you, Michael. On behalf of our founder and CEO, Eric Morcheski, the staff at Nimble Strategies, we thank you all for attending today's session, conducting capital campaigns in times of stress. Eric is a pragmatic, data-driven CEO, CFO, specializing in startups and turnarounds with for-profits, nonprofits, public-private partnerships, and has done it across 20 countries and 4 continents. Eric has also led one of the largest, if not the largest, and I'm sure he can correct it, public-private fundraising capital campaigns where they had a goal of over 250 million, and they raised in excess of 265 million. Again, my name is Dion Brown, the managing director here at Nimble Strategies. We just celebrated our 2nd year anniversary here, being founded. Eric founded the company 2 years ago this month. I've been in nonprofits, did 21 years in the Air Force, and now over 15 years in nonprofit services. Eric and I have been around each other since roughly indirectly since 2010. And in 2015-16, we collaborated when he was the CEO of the Gateway Arts Foundation. I was the executive director at the National Blues Museum. And we collaborated on a larger event that's held in St. Louis called Blues at the Arch that is still going on. Next slide. This is a little background on this, on the organization, the company. We got 30 plus years working for and consulting for nonprofits, small businesses, public-private partnerships, 6.5 million museum visitors at all of our locations, developed millions of dollars of earned income opportunity. That's one of our strong suits. And again, we've leadership roles in museum design and construction work projects of well over $1 billion. And we've raised quite a few money and during capital campaigns. No, you're fine, Eric. I had to pop up on my screen. All right, so these are a few takeaways that we came up with that we'd like for you all to take away from this presentation. One is discover the different types of campaigns people are running today in nonprofits. Identify the needs during the capital campaign. And hear from experts from across the country on how to apply. We even have someone, I believe, from your area that's going to speak to us later on. Types of campaigns. We have what we mostly know about is a traditional capital intensive project. Also the capital campaign that also ties in endowment. You have now, because of the stressor we have, the capital campaign plus COVID losses, and what I like to call destroy the debt. The first one, the traditional capital intensive project, we pretty much all aware of those. I like the destroy the debt one. And to me, that one and the capital campaign and COVID losses somehow tie in together. For instance, when I was at the B.B. King Museum, we had $1 million debt because of construction. And 3 months after I was there, I said, hey, we should go and burn the debt or destroy the debt because it was costing us $135,000 a year to service that loan. And my board chair said, well, we have donor fatigue. And I said, well, but if we put the right messaging, which we'll talk about later, the communications and the narrative and how you present your compelling case, it helps. And so we went to the public and told them about, how we could take that $135,000 a year we were servicing and put it back into the community through the programming that we did. Well, during that board meeting, during that board meeting, by the time the board chair agreed with it and the board agreed, before we walked out of the room, we had already raised $250,000 of that $1 million debt that we were trying to burn or destroy. And we started that campaign in April, and thankfully by December of the same year, it was wiped out. So even though we faced donor fatigue because they just did a capital campaign, it was all in the messaging and the programming and the communications that we had going on with the community. I will touch briefly on the capital campaign endowment. I haven't did one of those particularly, but what we've done at another institution is that we wanted a capital campaign, but we wanted to also have an endowment. And from one of our feasibility studies at that time, and this is where feasibility studies come in to play, certain donors didn't want to necessarily put into an endowment, but they wanted to help align the institution for further. So when we came up with our budget, we set aside a certain amount for the endowment. Excellent. So with those types of campaigns, there's decisions that have to be made. Feasibility study. I just mentioned about the feasibility study. It's a must. It must be a part of the initial steps to identify which of the campaigns your supporters will engage. Again, back to that capital campaign or the capital campaign plus a endowment, destroy the debt, or to tie it into COVID. What are the most glaring needs coming out of this time of stress? Regardless if it's the pandemic, the market crash, which I'll talk about in the next one, how will you message the campaign, especially relating to the external stresses? Again, pandemic, market crash. You name it, there's all kinds of stressors that can come into not just a nation, but for your community that can cause stressors that come up. And then you have to look at how that message be received by your donors, the constituents, and what do you need to be successful?
Would help if I was unmuted, but so thanks, Dion. I think please feel free to drop questions, as Michael noted, into the Q&A or the chat. We'd love to, make sure that we're addressing your specific needs in that, especially, even in that first section there on the different types of campaigns. If you're not as familiar with the Destroy the Debt campaign or Burn the Debt campaign, really great option, really great messaging opportunity right now of, we looked inward during COVID and said, what are creating the biggest stresses for our organization? And debt is a stress, whether you're a for-profit or nonprofit, whether you're an individual or a corporation. Debt is never something that you wake up and go, God, I'm glad I have that. So, if you do have questions here, please ask them. We're happy to address any specific questions as we go. First step in any capital campaign, as Dion mentioned, is the feasibility study. We talk to a lot of, especially smaller groups that don't understand why they need to do a feasibility study. What we hear time and again is, I know what I want to raise money for. And that's great. And that's great that you have this clear identified direction for yourself, but you need to understand what someone wants to pay for. And that isn't you, unless you're writing that whole check yourself, in which you don't need to listen to us anymore and you can feel free to log off. But, during those times of stress, what's changed and why is there a difference today than there was 2 years ago? Why was there a difference in 2009 than there was in 2007, 2001 versus 2000 with the tech crash? So, during a time of stress, it's not typical to see a lack of, it is typical to see a lack of your board's interest. And it's not that they don't care anymore. They do care, but a lot of times your board members, especially if you have a very high powered board, are running their own businesses across the city or across the country. And they go inward, because if you have something that is a community issue or a national issue like the pandemic or like the stock market crash in 2008 and 2009, what you have is they have to have the immediate concern for their primary interest. And a board member cares deeply about your organization, but their primary interest is oftentimes somewhere else. And so we all devote most of our attention to our primary interests. And so it's important, one, to understand that this happens, but two, you shouldn't be frustrated and wonder why it's happening to you running an organization, or as a board member wondering where your other board members are, because this is a very natural occurrence that happens. Historically, willingness to give has followed the stock market. One key time that didn't happen was in this last year during the pandemic, and the stock market actually took off, but we actually saw a lot of people taking two different paths. And so some people said wait, and some people said run. Some people said run because they looked at the stock market and said, hey, we need to take advantage of this, because that's when people feel their wealth rise, is when they see the stock market rise. And likewise, if they see the stock market fall, they feel that they are no longer have the wealth to fund anything outside of immediate interest, and don't oftentimes want to make a longer term commitment. So a 5-year commitment of your pledges. They don't want to do that because they have this uncertainty to where their wealth will go. And then, you need to look at how the time of stress changes your interview and in-person contact perspective. Not typically an issue until this last year. Obviously, we saw during the pandemic a lot of people, whether it was for a capital campaign, whether it was just for annual development, people didn't want to meet in person, and you probably didn't want to meet with them in person. So it was mutual. But the fact of the matter is, it's in person, it's one-on-one communications that is where your largest dollars are raised. And so you need to conquer that issue if you're going to be successful in a capital campaign during times like the last year. So some decisions you need to make, where is your funding coming from? So a lot of times with nonprofits, most of your funding comes from individuals. However, as Dion mentioned, when we were doing the Gateway Arch Park Foundation, when we ran the capital campaign for the Arch, the majority of our giving was corporate. And that is a pretty epic shift. And on major projects, it's not atypical. We did a lot on a national basis too, where talking with major corporations from across the country on what they might have interest in on capital campaigns. And especially if you have something iconic or something that has a high visibility and aligns to their brand, then you see opportunities for real success. And the one that I like to use a lot is we were dealing with American Express, and they said, okay, so we're not against capital campaigns, which there are some corporations that are, but where we like to align our capital campaigns is something that we feel aligns to who we are as a business. And the example they used is they funded all the gold leaf on the ceiling of Union Station in Washington, D.C. And they felt that gold leaf was a true representation of American Express and who they were. So it was $15, $16, $17 million worth of gold leaf. So that's not an insignificant sum that they put up, but it's not that Union Station necessarily, although travelers obviously align well to American Express brand, but it was really about finding something that uniquely paired to their interests. Again, why it's important to make sure that those groups are part of your feasibility study to make sure you can align your campaign to those interests. What opportunities exist for the organization through the capital campaign, and what we mean by that is those types of campaigns. You should be testing whether you should have a traditional campaign, whether you should have an endowment component to it, a COVID component to it, a destroy the debt component to it. You can test all of those things, and it's a really important piece to test is not just the physical components or the programming components of your campaign, but also what types people want to support. And really, you're not just looking for, we get 100% success in this because people really engaged with it, although that would be almost a pipe dream, but really beautiful if it happened, but also what the wording is that's coming out of their response to it. So I like this, or here's what I would like to see here. Those are things that are starting to adjust your messaging to make sure that when you're out in public with that capital campaign, you're aligning the message well so that it's better received. And especially where you see those things occur time and again from your different interviews, from different surveys, you really start to see a pattern emerge that will allow you to really capitalize on it. And does your capital campaign committee agree with the goals and opportunities of the feasibility study? Your capital campaign committee is going to be writing letters. They're going to be making personal asks, hosting events. If they don't get behind the goals and opportunities that you're throwing out there, you've missed the opportunity there to really engage them, because if they don't feel an alignment to it, they're not going to do it. And it cannot be, well, it can be if you're really just a one-man wrecking crew, one-woman wrecking crew, you can maybe raise enough money to have a successful capital campaign. But the truth is, you have much better success as a group of people than you will as one individual. And then you have to identify your donor base, and it's really getting an understanding of who they are and what their capacities are, and whether they have the capacities to truly see you through to a successful campaign. And so if you know that you only have 10 people that might be able to give you $100,000, but you want to do a $20 million campaign, you know you don't have the donor base to support that. And so you either need to adjust your campaign or find the donor base. With that said, we're going to listen to hear Sarah Crazen, the Senior VP of Fundraising of CCS's Boston office. CCS Fundraising is, we like to call him the 800-pound gorilla of nonprofit fundraising and capital campaigns especially. And Sarah's a great person, in your own neck of the woods, we definitely encourage you to reach out to her if you're considering a capital campaign. So she's going to talk a little bit here on that external perspective on capital campaigns right now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Crazen, Senior Vice President with CCS Fundraising's Boston office.
All right. I got a little greedy and
The core business of our firm is campaign planning and management, and we've had the distinct privilege of partnering with many Mass Cultural Council grantees over the years. Thank you for inviting me to share a perspective on the role campaign feasibility studies play in a time of stress or great uncertainty. Especially over the past 15 months, my colleagues at CCS and I have been asked over and over again if we think fundraising as we knew it has been changed forever. Particularly for our friends and clients in the arts and culture space, the past year has been extraordinarily challenging, and the idea of pursuing bold plans and big campaigns seems counterintuitive. But I'm here to offer the perspective that it's not counterintuitive at all. And in fact, that undertaking a feasibility study during a time of stress or uncertainty could actually be one of the most powerful things your organization could do. When COVID first hit, CCS reflected back on our experience working with nonprofits during 2008 and 2009 in the midst of the Great Recession. From our perspective, the key takeaway from that time, with the benefit of hindsight, was this: those organizations that kept going, kept engaging with their donors, and kept activity moving were ultimately rewarded. These successful organizations, and we did work with many, many nonprofits who successfully completed campaigns during or immediately after the recession, recognized that they couldn't control the broader economy, but doubled down on what they could control. Those who stopped, paused, delayed, especially around campaign efforts, they faced significant challenge on the other side of that crisis, as many of their loyal donors, having not been engaged by the organizations they were supporting, had found other interests. So even when the economic climate is strong, we would never recommend that as a primary reason to test or proceed with the campaign. It helps, certainly, but trying to time the market with a feasibility study to wait for a more certain time, a better stock market, certainty around COVID reemergence and so forth, it can be paralyzing. Regardless of when you conduct a campaign, there's always going to be competition for the philanthropic dollar. And in working with many cultural institutions over the past year, we focused on helping them put their best foot forward, running their own race, and going to your supporters to ask if they will help. And regardless of what kind of stress that we're ultimately under, because let's be honest, we live in a time of perpetual stress, it seems, there's a natural need for more communication at those moments rather than less. No donor, particularly at the highest and most engaged levels, wants to watch their beloved cultural institutions go through a major crisis, delay an important project, or in the worst case, close, and be left asking, is there something else that I could have done? So my call to action to all of you is this: if you have a campaign worth pursuing, don't just view the feasibility study as a decision-making tool. Instead, take a broader lens. A study, when done well, can at a very pure level help us get back to the basics of donor engagement and retention, where we invite donors to be our real partners in advancing our mission. Thanks again to Nimble Strategies for the opportunity for CCS to share this perspective.
So thank you for Sarah for doing that. I apologize. I started to say I got a little greedy there and tried to launch a poll, and apparently Zoom just does not like playing the video and running polls or responding to chat while a video is playing. So I apologize for that, but we've gotten it resolved, hopefully, for everyone else. So turn it over to Dion here. I actually will at the same time launch a poll while a video is not playing. And, really, we just want to hear from you, knowing kind of what those different campaign types are and, going through those feasibility studies, what type of campaigns are you running or considering running?
Next slide is community and major donors. The differences on the community. It's difficult to meet in person. Lead donors, major donors, are all about relationships. so many times we have these donors and they're used to meeting in person, but in times of stress, as Sarah just said, you can't stop communicating. It's continued, either board members contacting that donor, you as the ED, development officer, constant contacts. And it keeps them engaged, as Sarah said, and it pays off in the end. Another difference is on a large scale, still seeing major donors get on planes to take meetings and to keep the campaign going. I had a donor that was had his own jet, obviously, and he used to travel the country. He was traveling the country actually, still speaking to different donors as we were doing a capital campaign, which it helped immensely. They met at coffee shops. This was later on during this particular pandemic. They would meet outdoors. They still kept that line of communication, which kept us moving forward. Larger gifts are still being made right now, and what is left is the middle ground for donors to give. So the larger gifts, we found that during the pandemic or this particular stressor, large gifts were still being given, and Eric will touch on it later on what those numbers really look like. And what's left, when we say is in the middle ground, you got those that can give, $3,000 over 3 years, 5 years, but those $25,000 gifts, they're still there. And that's where they're looking to find, that's what's left for us to go after. Another thing changed, timing of those funds before organization went public with their capital campaign. Previously, some people went at once they raised 50%, and now some are waiting until they hit 75, 85%. And of course, as you all know, is to make you look like you had a very successful capital campaign by waiting, 75, 85%. You only got 15% more to go. Do we want to look at the polls yet, Eric, or you want to keep going? Oh, I'll keep going.
We shared them, so hopefully you can see them. It looks like a lot of people are really considering or are currently running a capital campaign with an endowment. Was our primary winner, with a few people running more of a traditional campaign, and then one person also looking like they were running the campaign with the COVID losses. So, right. Kudos to you all. I mean, hopefully you're all being successful if you're already running it, or if you're considering running it and have done that feasibility study, hopefully you're getting a good response. But I think it's one of those that, especially with the COVID losses component to it, one thing to keep in mind is that as Americans, we have a short memory. And so the further we get away from lockdown, the less people will be interested in supporting a COVID initiative. And so, as day-to-day life comes back into more of a traditional sense, even though it may not be exactly the same, that is something to keep in mind as you're messaging things.
I'd like to ask those that's doing the capital campaign and the endowment, if they don't mind chiming in, or any of them actually, how far in the process are you in your campaign? If they want to chime in, if they put those answers up, we can go back and look at them, Eric, and I'll continue on with this slide before we go to the next presentation. So some more of the decisions you have to make from the community side. Who needs to be a part of your capital campaign committee? On ours, we had a capital campaign committee that it started out with 3 board members. And then from that 3 board members, we looked at who in the community that could help fulfill it. So we took people from the outside that wasn't on the board, but were philanthropic or were very influential in the community. And then that's who we use to help build our team to make a successful campaign. Does your board have the right connections to engage the lead donors? And again, this ties into us looking at external individuals to be on our capital campaign committee, because a board member knew this one individual had a direct contact with their connections to a very large donor who was interested in us, but we didn't have someone that could approach him on our board level, on that level. So by us making sure we had the right people on that committee, it really helped us advance our goals. And how do you engage? You know, you got to come up with a plan on how do you engage the lead donors. Will it be the ED, the board chair, a combination of both, or somebody from that community along with the president or executive director, along with that key stakeholder to go talk to them? What steps can you take now? You got to think about that. What steps can you take now to ensure pledge fulfillment? Options, options, options. You know, we live in, as one individual says, you'll hear coming up, very seldom do they write checks. Even my bills, I pay 90% of my bills online. So if you can get to the point, everybody won't line with it, but those who do, making it easier and easier for them to make their payments in, either through credit card, direct bill, whatever, so they don't have to physically do anything. It'll help fulfill some of those pledges. Another decision is donor recognition. Moving to a more digital society, are there new ways you can or should engage donor recognition? I mean, we all know about the donor boards, but those aren't the only ways. We have our newsletters, we have publications that we do. We do public thank yous through social media. That's with that donor's permission also, because sometimes those donors do not want that publicity. They don't want to be known about it. Eric, did we get any responses to the?
One, Chris Ann is considering a capital campaign, so hasn't started one yet.
Okay. So next up we have another presentation.
And so we'll launch another poll real quick while we're talking here. But so for those of you that are running capital campaigns, or have pledges out there, we're looking to kind of understand, what percentage of your pledges are being fulfilled. Hopefully it's 100%, but I think we all know even during the best of times, it's not 100%. So hopefully it's higher than the bottom here. If we see anyone clicking on 25%, we'll hold a moment of silence for your organization. But post campaign. So this is something that maybe we don't talk about as often as we should when we're thinking through a capital campaign, but post campaign can be just as critical as during the campaign, because if you're not actually collecting the pledges, then what was the point of asking for them? And so, this is again where in some times of stress, people are pulling out of their pledges. One of the best examples I have for this is not someone necessarily pulling out of their pledges, but delaying their pledge. We were designing a science museum at Oklahoma State University, and T. Boone Pickens was funding the whole thing. And 2008, 2009 hit extremely hard on the economy. And T. Boone was someone who had, to most of us, what we would consider endless sums of money. But even he said, I'm pulling this pledge out of the check that I was going to write for you to make this happen, and I'm moving this into my will. And that was 2008, 2009, I believe, and hopefully I'm not killing off someone who actually is still alive, but I believe T. Boone died in 18 or 19. So that moved that museum 10 years down the road. And so, that's what tends to happen in times of stress, is either people are changing it or people are shifting it. And that's happening whether that's the person who's giving you $100 or whether that was the person giving you $250 million. It really isn't making that difference. It's that time of stress is creating that. If programming was a major portion of your capital campaign, you may not be able to execute your programming. We saw that a lot during the last year. How have you shifted it, and how are people going to be responding to that? And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, is if you have to change what you've told people you will be doing, how are they going to accept that change? And that's really where this next piece comes in: education, education, education. Whether it's on how to make a gift, shifts that you're making because of something that's changed, or anything else, communication and education through communication is so critical to the success of your campaign and after your campaign as well. Because the other piece to it is, if you're not educating after the campaign, your future giving will suffer. And one of the examples I give, so Dion mentioned earlier, we ran a $250 million capital campaign for the Gateway Arch. And we said, we're going to build this project. Check, we did that. That's easy to show people that you succeeded at it. But that project, we said, that's going to increase visitation to the Arch by 1 million people per year. And that in turn will have an economic impact of one Cardinals baseball season. And we did it in that way because if you say 200 million or $300 million a year, people just don't understand or comprehend that because it's one big number versus another big number. We said one Cardinals baseball season because it's St. Louis and people understood, oh, I go to Cardinals games and there's 40,000 people there for 81 games a year. And so it was something that people really gravitated towards and understood. Well, so after we completed the capital campaign, after we completed the project, we ran an economic study to see the impact our project made on the community. And it's very rare. Most people run the economic study pre-capital campaign because they want to say, look at the impact we're going to make if you give us these dollars. Very rare that someone runs it after the fact to say, we succeeded, or no, we didn't, and here's what we're going to do to fix that. But it allowed us to have a very open dialogue with the community to say, hey, we told you we were going to generate $300 million a year and new economic impact on St. Louis. And actually we were at like 960 million. And so think about what else we could do if with the next dollars you give us. And so really an important way for you to keep that education going so that you can keep the communication going and keep those future campaigns successful. The other piece in here, and we've touched on it a little bit, perceived wealth. So stock market fluctuations give a rise and fall to perceived wealth, not necessarily real wealth. So what we mean by that is, if there's probably no better example, if you are invested and have 10 Bitcoins, you probably don't even know how to cash them out. But you look at that daily and see, today I'm worth $3 million and tomorrow I'm worth $45, and the next day I'm worth $2 million, and it ebbs and flows consistently. That is your perceived wealth, right? That is, you don't even know how to cash that out, most likely. But perceived wealth changes your giving patterns as much or more than real wealth. And so it's something to think about is when you're messaging this, especially post-campaign, think about it in a perceived wealth context. Those decisions you need to make, plan ahead. Dion mentioned it during the campaign, really important here to make sure that it's not something that now that you've completed the campaign, you're starting to think of how do you fulfill it. This is really important here to think through early on how people will fulfill those pledges and how you will reach that success. Build close relationships. That I think is true of, there's probably a number of development directors on this call right now that will say that's as common sense as breathing, as common sense of eating, because without those close relationships, it will not be successful. Communication, I've hit on it a number of times. Dion's hit on it a number of times. It's so critical how important it is to communicate. Ease of fulfillment. This is one where we've started touching on it, and actually our next video will touch on it a little bit as well. Make it as easy as possible to fulfill a pledge. Our next video, he's going to talk through a little bit of how their capital campaign went, how they exceeded their goals, but also the pieces they put in to make fulfillment as easy as possible. And a lot of that comes through education, whether it's a giving that's already scheduled out for someone, or whether it's here's how you can make a stock gift to us, and here's what this impacts, how this impacts your tax situation. All of those things are really critical. Adjusting programming to meet societal needs, whether that's, or changes, whether that's related to COVID or whether that's related to issues that are going on within your community that you need to address. And again, I feel that as much as anything, that goes back to that communication aspect and education of opportunities, making sure people understand the opportunities that exist for your organization to be successful or more successful down the road. I see Veronica has a question here, and we'll touch on it. Could you provide some tips and links, resources on how to go about forecasting economic impact of a capital project? Is there an industry that does this for projects? So there are a number of firms out there that do economic impact studies. And Michael, I'm not sure if I'm misreading this, but it says you would like to answer. So if you would like to answer, please feel free. But also, maybe this is my time to pitch the Mass Cultural Council as a great resource.
No, Eric, that means we'll answer it live. So that's you.
Okay, thank you. But so we've worked with a number of firms. There are actually several that actually even focus specifically on the arts and culture institutions. And so, I think it's important to find someone who understands your industry specifically. Someone who's running a capital campaign for the Red Cross is probably going to have a different perspective than when someone was running a capital campaign for the Big Dig when it was going on in Boston, or someone who, was running the Red Sox Hall of Fame. There's going to be different perspectives to all of those things. And so finding someone that is very specific to you is a really good thing. I would also note that a lot of times if you're receiving any city, state, or federal funds, they want to know the economic impact that's a part of that funding process. I would personally, I would say there are a couple of perspectives to it. There are perspectives that would say go local with someone that understands your community, versus when we did our capital campaign, and I am blanking on their name off the top of my head, but they were out of New York City. We interviewed 3 or 4. One was out of London, and then 2 or 3 were out of New York City. And there was one out of St. Louis that we considered. They had done the initial economic impact study. If you send me an email, and our emails will be at the end of this, we'll be happy to remember who those groups were. But in the meantime, I would really say your economic impact comes through, and Deanna and I do a talk about this a fair amount, from your direct impact. That's your salaries that you pay out, your contractors, the expenses you have for the capital project. Your indirect impact, that's the visitors that are coming in and staying at hotels and going to those other things within the community. And then there's the going beyond that. All economic impact studies will then show that multiplier effect, that dollar into your community that you've created, how many times over that gets spent. And so if you want to think about that as, if someone comes and they spend $10 to come into the front door of your museum or your arts organization, well, you use that $10, you have 30% of your expenses go to salaries. And so 3 of those $10 are going to your staff. Well, that staff then turns around and spends that on rent. So that's another layer to it. That rental income, hopefully whether that's a bank that they're paying a mortgage on, or whether that's an apartment complex they live in, those dollars are getting recycled within your community. And so they actually measure, based on how money is being spent, how many times it cycles in and through your community. So to me, as a numbers person, it's truly fascinating. For those that are not numbers people, they probably look at me like I have 3 heads when I get really excited about it. But thank you, Michael, for also sharing Americans for the Arts, a great resource there. So like I said, feel free to email us. We'll actually, I'll be happy to share some of those groups with you. In the meantime, Peter DeKirtree. So Peter actually, ironically, comes from CCS as well, but he is someone that I've known personally for 15 years now. He had been a managing director of a CCS office, and then he had moved on. He ran a company that focused on capital campaigns and fundraising for Newman Centers, which are Catholic centers on public universities, and then moved to Australia to help the Australian diocese learn how to fundraise, teach their diocese how to fundraise. And now he's in Oklahoma City and just completed a capital campaign. So we thought this was a really unique opportunity to actually hear from someone what they did to successfully fulfill their capital campaign.
Hi there. My name is Peter DeCartree, and I'm the Executive Director of Stewardship and Development for the Catholic Archdiocese of Oklahoma City and the Catholic Foundation of Oklahoma. I'm here today to just briefly talk about our experience with post-campaign activity and fulfillment of pledges. My talk is going to be no more than 3 to 5 minutes, so I just want to share with you a couple of the nuggets that are related to a campaign that we ran here in the diocese. First of all, you should know that this is the first ever capital campaign run by our organization, the Catholic Archdiocese of Oklahoma City. It began in July of 2017 and ended in June of 2019. That is to say that the active phase of solicitation, where we did major gifts, kind of in all different layers of solicitation activity over that 2-year period of time. Our original goal for the capital campaign was 55 million. We had pledges of 91 million. And I'm very, very pleased to tell you that as of today, we have fulfilled just over 57 million in cash payments. At the same time, we've written off about $4 million so far. I expect by the end of the campaign, we'll write off at least 6 million, maybe as much as 10. So to put it in perspective, we started at 55. We had pledges of 91. We've already fulfilled 57. What that means is that the Catholic community here, or our general broad community in 106 different parishes and missions, responded tremendously well to the campaign at a much higher level than expected from our feasibility and planning study. We did a planning study early on. We interviewed major donors, we interviewed key constituents, and that study told us that we could probably stretch to raise 55. We ended up stretching to raise 91. I will tell you that fulfillment of the campaign has been something that we planned for all along. We've had wonderful fulfillment of electronic pledge payments. I'm a very big believer that for smaller level donors, that is to say a donor that gives, $3,000 over a 5-year period, $50 a month for 60 months, or $100 a month for 60 months for a $6,000 pledge over 5 years, or even up to pretty larger gifts. Electronic fulfillment is a key strategy that we have implemented to fulfill those gifts over time. People are used to paying their bills electronically. I haven't written a check personally in many years. If I'm going to do any kind of a check at all, I go into my bank account and I send a check to an organization. So I'm 49 years old. I'm not atypical. We just don't use a checkbook anymore. So electronic fulfillment is really important. So setting it up, the initial stage of a pledge, I'll give you $100 a month for the next 5 years, or I'll give you, $347 a month for the next 5 years to get to a $25,000 pledge, et cetera. Those kind of things. But electronic fulfillment is absolutely crucial in my mind to long-term fulfillment of smaller gifts. For larger gifts, we spent a lot of time talking to our donors about qualified charitable distributions, which used to be called the IRA charitable rollover. The IRS changed the name for the charitable rollover to the qualified charitable distribution several years ago. So the QCD is what we market, and any of our donors who are over 70 years old, it's a very tax advantageous way for them to make their pledge payments. We also have donors who give gifts of stocks, which obviously is another very tax advantageous way for donors to fulfill pledge payments. So we proactively market to those who've already made a pledge about how they can fulfill their pledge in an easier way, in a more tax advantageous way for them. We send out a lot of communication, both on social media and directly to our donors about what we're doing in terms of fulfillment of the campaign. We have found that even in the economic downturn of the oil industry, which really impacted us in Oklahoma in a very significant way, we have been very, very lucky to maintain our relationships with our biggest donors And in fact, even the ones that have paused their pledges are very clear that they want to restart their pledge payments eventually. And some have already done so. So we had a big slump in the oil and gas price, which dramatically impacted companies in Oklahoma. It started to come back now. And truth of the matter is, our donors are beginning to recover. The stock market crash of, what was it, last a year and a half ago, recovered very quickly. And in fact, most of our donors have not been impacted by the markets at all, or very little, in that they've told us about. The one thing that the market does that is really relevant to pledge fulfillment is if people feel like they are less wealthy, then they make fewer gifts. If they feel like they're more wealthy, then they can make more gifts. Whether the reality of that for their daily cash flow is true or not, it is a perception, a feeling of wealth. And that is a real factor for us. But I will say that whether it's the pandemic or the economy or any other factor, building close relationships with our donors, going to see them and talk to them, being really clear about communication, about what we do, how we're doing it, spending a lot of time saying, here, your dollars at work are making these things happen. And then finally, making it easy for fulfillment to happen, whether it's electronic monthly fulfillment through an automated system, which I think is really critical, or making it easier for donors to give stocks or QCDs or other things along the way. Anyway, I wish you the best in your campaign. Thanks. Take care.
So knowing Peter for several years now, I will say getting Peter in under 6 minutes is actually quite an accomplishment. So he does a great job with all of these things and really appreciative. I would also say the first time he talked about writing checks, he said it to me as I was writing a check to someone, and I am noticeably younger than Peter. So I laugh about that today, but he is correct. Most people do not write checks anymore. So finding that automatic deduction set up for people is a really critical factor for everyone. So kind of closing us out here, you've heard about the feasibility study during the campaign, post-campaign, what does the current landscape look like? And I think we've all noticed the COVID effect on a number of different things. These numbers are probably 6 months old now, but 901,206 registered nonprofits in the US, 92% have a budget of less than $1 million. So we often talk to people and they're like, oh, I don't have any budget. I have a, $1.7 million budget or something. And I kind of laugh because I'm like, well, that puts you in the top 8% for sure of the country of nonprofits. But even if you're talking $700,000-800,000 budget, you're probably in the top 75%, top 25% of nonprofits in the country. And there are a lot of people out there operating on a $200,000 or $300,000 a year budget or less, even in some cases, purely community-based, community-focused. The other piece to it is nonprofits are primarily community-based and local focused, and thus so are your donations. When you start talking, I want to engage a major company to make a contribution, especially on a capital campaign, you really have to be thinking about how does this relate to them? How does this factor into what they're doing? Because if you're Apple or Amazon, it needs to be something that they can say to their employees, to someone, here's how we impacted you all. And it's harder for them to do that on a community-based local focus than it is on a national focus. And so you have to be very specific in that reasoning. These, to me, are scary but understandable. 50% of nonprofits have 3 months of cash on hand. 10% have 1 month, meaning they can afford to fund the next month of their operations. But if they don't raise funds in this month, they don't know what they'll do next month. And those lost sales, events, and fundraisers, especially for arts organizations, has really been crucial, critical, and problematic. So, probably not anything here that completely surprises you, but maybe something that's hopefully good to make you feel like you're not alone. The two angles that we've seen groups take with this, during the last year, the people, some groups have said, we're going to hide, we're going to cut every cost we can, we're going to minimize everything we can, and just hope to survive through this. we saw we saw AAM, the American Association of Museums, report last year that said 1 in 3 museums will close within the next year. Those that are not adapting and finding new revenue streams and program awareness will be in this group. The other side, Nimble, we're biased to the word. Obviously, it's our name, Nimble Strategies. We found that there were groups that found new ways to build their recognition, awareness, and fundraising. And one of my favorite stories that came out of the pandemic, and I'm biased because they're a client of ours, but Thanksgiving Square Foundation in Dallas, in April of last year, they started a campaign they called Serving Up Gratitude and raised $250,000, the most they had raised in decades for a single event. The last time they had raised $250,000 for one thing was when the park was built in 1977. They used that to purchase meals from small and local restaurants to feed the nurses and doctors and first responders of the Dallas community. And what they did is they fed at least one meal to every doctor and nurse at the major hospitals across Dallas, and then turned around and took it further and fed all of the ambulance workers, all of the firefighters and police department. They made sure that they could feed the people who were out trying to protect people from everything going on with COVID. And you went from an organization that they would have told you, they did tell me last February, their belief was that if you got more than 3 blocks away, 99% of Dallas did not know who they were. To today, they have seen time and again coverage of their organization and the amazing job they've done with this. And they've turned it around. They actually expanded upon it, and are doing a number of other initiatives out of this Serving Up Gratitude piece that started with the focus of buying from the local restaurants that were suffering and feeding the nurses and doctors who were overworked. So really, I think a great story, but talk about being nimble. You went outside of your comfort zone and did something that was well within their mission. Their mission was gratitude, and they found a way to serve up gratitude during that time. So any questions, you can feel free to still pop them into the chat here or the Q&A. This is Dion and I's email. We've also set up a few free resources here. So the nimblestrategies.com/MCC, that actually has the presentation. It has both of the videos that you saw here, as well as actually the leadership development presentation we did a couple weeks ago for MCC on there, and the videos for that if you missed it and are curious. The other one we have here, we have a strategic planning prep kit that is free for people to download, and it's focused on developing developing preparedness for running a strategic plan, which we do a lot of. And so we kind of felt like people were intimidated coming into them, and so we wanted to build a platform that allowed you to kind of know what you were getting into from a timeline, from a resource standpoint, and really start to better understand it. So please feel free to use them. Please feel free to reach out to us. The other thing I would note is, as part of this, what we offered to Mass Cultural Council is we would do 1-hour coaching sessions specific to each group. So if you want to send us an email and want to reach out to say, hey, like, here's where we are in our planning for a capital campaign, or during our capital campaign process, help me understand what I should be doing next. Or even if you just want, I noted it earlier for the economic impact groups, but if you want 3 names of companies that do feasibility studies, we'll be happy to share some people that we've worked with in the past, or some good organizations to reach out to, or campaign fulfillment groups, or anything else. I mean, we're happy to be a resource for you all so that you all can be successful. And I think, we get the good fortune to work with incredible groups across the country, and we'd be grateful to help you as well, with whatever it is you need, whether that is capital campaigns, or whether that's leadership development, or whether that's just some personal questions as you're kind of going through your day-to-day as an organization. Dion, anything else that I should touch on, or that you want to touch on?
No, you did.
Wisdom.
great presentation, Eric, and it took us right up to the 2 o'clock hour. So great job. Thank you all for attending.
All right, thank you, Dion and Eric, and 3 o'clock for us. So we're already an hour ahead of you. Thanks for everyone for attending our session, and I hope that if you do have any questions that you want to follow up with Eric or Dion individually about your own capital campaign, feel free to go ahead and do that. That is part of the service here. Beyond that, I wish you all a good rest of the week. Stay safe, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.